I want to start this talk by evaluating the option of going to work in a foreign, needy place the same way we evaluate all the things we do to and for our patients, with their attendant risks, benefits, alternatives, and complications. I will start this way, but let me say here at the beginning that I'm not going to finish this way. So let's start with the big complication of them all, death. Likely the first risk that will come to your mind and the minds of your family and friends when you tell them you're going to work in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. It's on all our consent forms, so let's talk about it. This is the last known photo of Tom Little, taken in early August last year. Tom is third from the left, sitting with Dr. Tom Grams, a visiting American dentist, Glenn Lapp, an American administrator who directed Noor's outreach projects, and to the right of Tom, Dan Terry, an American who had spent a few decades in Afghanistan in a number of roles. Here they are, sitting as guests in a Nuristani home on a break from the mother-child ophthalmic and dental clinics they had hiked over a 16,000-foot pass to bring to this remote, terribly needy people. Tom had a strong connection to the Nuristanis, had been to this valley 4 other times, and I had gone there with him on an eye camp in 2000. The traditionally easier southern approach is regarded as too dangerous nowadays, so Tom and a team of 11 others approached from the more difficult northern route, moving equipment on foot and horseback to the beautiful Page River Valley. On their return, they were suddenly and unexpectedly joined by a band of militants who, without ceremony, killed Tom first, then all the others save 2. One had left earlier by the southern route to visit family. The other was spared as he recited the Quran, and has given us an eyewitness account of the massacre. Libby and her daughters, the Noor program, and all Afghanistan lost a good man in Tom Little. God had protected us countless times overseas, but we all knew that He might not always protect us from dying, even from murder. The IAM had lost no expatriate member to murder since 1981. It's difficult to say that a sovereign God might give you up to an earthly fate like Tom's, but there it is. Even here, each of us must come to grips with his or her own death, and all our fears surrounding that. Of course, the leading cause of missionary death is car accident, and if you spend a significant amount of time in a needy place, you're bound to be caught in one. In 1994, I rolled a Land Cruiser containing myself and 4 other unbelted passengers off an icy road in a remote region. In 2001, just before our expulsion by the Taliban, my wife and 4 little children, all unrestrained, were traveling in Kabul in a taxi struck and rolled over by a teenage Talib driver. In both these accidents, we were all quite miraculously spared serious injury, but there have been other injuries from war-related violence and numerous kinds of accidents. None of us ever suffered from severe vernal keratoconjunctivitis or contracted anthrax, but many of us spent many hours waylaid by gastroenteritis, hepatitis, typhoid, and other illnesses. Foreign medical care will probably never seem as good to you overseas as care back in the U.S. You are just going to have to accept this. Of course, we all want to be responsible for our families, and are perhaps much more ready to refuse work abroad because of risk to our family rather than to ourselves. Our spouses are a great treasure. Life abroad is stressful, and at many times my relationship with my wife certainly suffered as a result, sometimes for months at a time. During our first term in Kabul, the couple most successful in bringing Muslims to Christ ended up separating and finally divorcing. The enemy is relentless at this kind of warfare. Your spouse's role is important, whatever it may be. Stay-at-home moms are subject to an isolation that might be unbearable for some. Do not strong-arm your spouse overseas. The Lord must be speaking to both of you, and ultimately have both of you on the same page before you go. Children are subject to the same injuries and illnesses we are, of course. Once some dear friends even withdrew financial support from us because they felt we were unfairly endangering our children. But there are also nutritional, educational, and social risks to consider in most places of the needy world. The contortions we went through to see our children well educated were often tremendously challenging. Finally, we've seen the phenomenon of aging parents back home present great stress. There's no question that we have a responsibility to honor God and our parents by helping them when they need it. One of our friends could not return in time for his father's passing, and the final phone conversation with him from 10,000 miles away was so difficult. It seems to me that after residency, almost all of us get into a seemingly intractable position that makes it hard to leave the country, even for a short time. I do believe it's rarely as intractable as we think. Nevertheless, if you're gone for a long time, you have to consider that some of your professional knowledge and skills might suffer. You might not get frequent input on the latest approaches to various conditions, and your access to learning new surgical skills might be very limited indeed. If you are gone for a long time, you might worry, like I often did, about whether you'll still be competent or even employable when you return to the States. Internet access has made staying current easier, although you may work in a place that has no reliable access. I was the only foreign ophthalmologist in the country for most of the time I was in Afghanistan, and I really missed professional camaraderie. Granted, there was a unique kind of camaraderie with Afghan doctors, and I still hear from some of them, but it was lacking the common path background one would have in the United States with so many colleagues. Unless you go off to work at King Khalid Eye Hospital or some similar place, you are very likely to suffer financial loss. Twice over our years abroad we lost most of our possessions, once after an evacuation, and again after an expulsion. If you haven't done it yet, you will have to do some serious soul-searching about whether you will trust God with your stuff and take the consequences with joy. One of the things I found shocking and unpleasant about returning to the U.S. was the huge emphasis throughout our society on storing up treasure for retirement. The very term retirement portfolio was foreign to us, and we had nothing we could venture anyhow. But we had kept a house back in the U.S. after my residency. This was also very stressful to manage from so far away. Again, we threw ourselves on the mercy of God as our provider, and He provided. All of the transitions and the many stresses of cross-cultural living are tremendous, and I wouldn't minimize them. You must relearn how to do everything from speaking to shopping to even bathing. Some of this was a lot of fun, some was not. Adding to the stress was the sheer volume of patients I could not help medically at all. We worried often and learned to pray our anxieties back to God. We are still learning. In many ways, living abroad is lonely. It's no surprise that all this can result in depression. Though none of my children would trade his or her unusual upbringing for anything in the world, at least 3 of our 4 kids have suffered significant anxiety and depression back here in the States. The never-ending injustice, whether real or perceived, to us and to others, can lead us right down the path to a smoldering anger. We saw this issue of unsurrendered anger hamper or even destroy the testimony of a couple of teammates, and the Lord had to do a great work in me also in order to free me from this problem. The stress of cross-cultural living is likely to worsen whatever sin problem you are likely to fall into, not help it. Brothers and sisters, I would plead with you, if you are committing any sin habitually, please deal with it before you go. If you don't know where to go for real help, come to me later. I'm not an expert, but a sinner set free, and I'd be happy to talk to you as a brother. Unfortunately, some serving overseas have completely abandoned the faith. A fascinating but ultimately heartbreaking book was written by Daniel Everett, a former Wycliffe linguist who went to work with the Piraha Indians in the Amazon. Over the next few years, he began to buy into the worldview of the people he served, and ultimately rejected the relevance of Jesus altogether. He hasn't yet realized what a broken man he has become. We must all learn to use pressure to push us closer to the Lord, not come between us and Him. My advice is this: don't go it alone, or even close to alone, and share your doubts readily with those believers around you who can encourage, exhort, and even warn you when necessary. Whew, that's a lot of risk. It's a wonder any of us goes. But there are great benefits too, so let's think about those. Here in the U.S., we're quite detached from ancient cultures and their ways of thinking. In much of the world, His Word more readily becomes alive. I highly recommend Ken Bailey's books, Poet and Peasant, or Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, even if you don't go overseas. If you actively take in His Word daily as you work in a culture new to you, I guarantee you He will make it come alive in your new experiences. Here we often live under the illusion that life is under control. In difficult surroundings, that illusion is stripped away. We watched Him provide an incomprehensible peace to our children as rockets fell around us while we hunkered in the basement. They played contentedly with their Legos. We saw Him deliver us from serious injury in so many instances, including the car accidents I mentioned. If you rely on Him in new ways, your faith will grow. You will learn a whole new way of humility and gratefulness. You will be more awed at Jesus' mission to the world as you watch it in others and live it out yourself. Working in such a difficult place with followers of Jesus, we were blessed by the richest fellowship to be had on this earth. When Jesus promised 100-fold family and homes, even in this life, to everyone who would leave everything for his sake, he was not speaking in hyperbole. Libby reminded me yesterday that in the Mark passage, Jesus also promises persecutions. Funny we never claim that. We rejoiced greatly in our fellowship. You will too. And being so far from our home culture, we began to learn what it's like to live as a citizen of heaven. We gave up many of our Americanisms and Westernisms and learned something of the culture of Christ rather than an earthly culture. That was a huge blessing. Of course, you will bless the world. God did not give us our skills for nothing. He prepared these things long beforehand, and now we should walk in them. Overseas, you will have no choice but to live an incarnational life. Everything you do will be noticed. I felt like a pretty poor incarnation at many times, but I was still always reminded to relate to the world like Jesus would have me do. It was humbling, and it was wonderful. Amazingly, we found, even in a land known for its militant Muslims, that most people were more open to spiritual discussion than the average American, because those people understood that the spiritual realm was a real part of everyday life. They were resistant to change, but very open to dialogue. We learned over the years to engage people tactfully and lovingly. So will you. All these benefits are available to you, to your spouse, to your children, but there's also something in it just for you. This. I saw so many things that I had never seen before. Every day I saw the case of the month, and every month the case of the year. The blessing of the Internet made it easy to take advantage of this new knowledge to the fullest. Most of us who set out will think we're taking a big bag of goodies, mental and sometimes even material, to shower upon the natives, but virtually everyone who goes will be collecting a pretty big bag from the natives. Necessity is the mother of invention. You will learn new skills. So what are the alternatives to going? Well, obviously, you could stay here with 20,000 other ophthalmologists. I honestly think this is what most of us are meant to do, to stay here and work for our own people. This is a good thing. And while you're here, you could really focus on an underserved group, a poor population, a rural population, or some other group. That's even better. And while you're here, you really must pray for the world. That's imperative wherever you are. We all have more money than we need, so I hope we are all giving much of it away. I would have never left the U.S. at all, if not for the generosity of my brothers and sisters. And of course, many overseas medical missionaries would love to have your counsel. While overseas, I took advantage of an Orbis-related service for advice on challenging cases, as well as a CMDA service for missionary family health advice. They were both really helpful, and I'm sure there are other similar services you might donate your expertise to. Complications. Eliphaz did not say this for nothing. Trouble is inevitable. In 2004, a gifted pediatric ophthalmologist in the city I now live in was murdered by his own partner. Would he ever have guessed such a thing? Do you think one will avoid complications by not undertaking the journey? James did not say this for nothing. Our lives are a mist. A very gifted anterior segment surgeon with whom I spent a little time during my residency, I saw limping on a crutch a few years ago at the academy. Turns out he was under treatment for a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and suffered a septic necrosis of his femoral head. Is he practicing now? Is he still alive? I do not know. Do you think we will avoid complications by not undertaking the journey? Jesus did not say this for nothing. Each day has trouble. A gifted cornea guy, a friend, a godly believer in Jesus, had an accident on the freeway in 1999, and his wife has lived since then as a quadriplegic. The way of their lives these past 13 years is an amazing testimony to God's grace and their love for each other, but I'm sure they would never have chosen it. Do you really think you will avoid complications by not undertaking the journey? Jesus promised that we would have trouble in this world, but also wants to take heart because he has overcome the world. Complications are an inherent part of our lives, and the best thing we can do is to seek God's kingdom and his righteousness and allow him to redeem those situations for his glory. So is anyone bothered by the RBAC method of deciding whether one should go serve out of his own home country or not? Well, I am. I don't think God intends us to evaluate this question this way at all. But if we can't evaluate this with a cost-benefit analysis, what then? Human logic would dictate we all stay. It costs less, there are plenty of people who need the Lord here, and we seem to be most fit for our native culture. You can certainly be more productive, at least by the standards we typically use in our practices here, but the Lord does not use human logic to make his decisions. If you haven't read John Piper's book, Let the Nations Be Glad, I'd recommend that too. It explains exactly how God thinks about missions, and I think explains it well. In fact, the Lord is completely illogical by human standards. We either need the wisdom of God, or we need to submit to his wisdom, though we might not understand it when he calls us. We must seek his kingdom and his righteousness wherever we are. Our lives are not about how many cases we do. If we claim to be followers of Christ, are we doing everything? Are we living our lives, whether here or abroad, to the glory of God? If you are born of the Spirit, your origin and your destination may not be clear to the world. The way the Lord moves you might not be clear to everyone around you. It might not even be entirely clear to yourself. But you must go wherever he blows you. Among the items on Tom Little's body, stained with blood and dirt, returned to Libby by the FBI, were some notes on a folded paper with the cryptic comment, "Use the Nuristani goat cheese story." You might ask Libby for the full story, but the comment referred to Tom's exposition of 2 Corinthians 2:15-16. For we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing, to one a fragrance from death to death, to the other a fragrance from life to life. Now in Nuristan virtually everyone makes goat cheese, which must be one of the most pungent substances on earth. The odor permeates every home and whole villages, and you can smell a Nuristani coming from a long way off. So there Tom went, bringing medical care to needy people and carrying with him the aroma of Christ, or as a writer for World Magazine put it, reeking of Christ. He lost his life for that, and no doubt has found his life safe in Jesus. And brothers and sisters, will we go whenever he takes us, carrying the aroma of Christ wherever he takes us, and bearing whatever the consequences for his sake.